Welcome back, everyone, to the second part of our lesson on marine mammals and sound. And now that you've had a chance to look very closely at the graphs of marine mammal hearing ranges, and you've been discussing the frequency of sound that these animals can hear well and what sounds they can't hear at all. So now you've had a chance to unpack some of the information on these graphs. You can see that there are vast differences in the frequencies of sound that are useful to different species of marine mammals. For example, you've discovered that the sound of 120,000 hertz or 120 kilohertz would be a useless signal to try to get a sea otter's attention, but it would be a great way to call in your trained harbor porpoise. Likewise, sending a code of 20 hertz to a pilot whale, it wouldn't work at all, but it would be just right for sending a signal to a blue whale. In order to make sense of all this diversity, especially in terms of the different frequencies of sounds that all these very different animals are using in the marine environment, we need to think a little about history and really long Earth history. We need to go back and think about the fossil record and how different marine mammals have ended up being so well adapted to living in the ocean. So in the hundreds of millions of years that mammals have been on land, they've adapted to all ranges of terrestrial habitats and conditions. There are animals that live in hot, dry places and others that live in cold, wet conditions. There are some that live in tropical rainforests and others that live in the open grassland savannas. And there are mammals that can run really quickly or hop or leap really high or fly. There are others that can burrow in the ground. There are some that are very large. There are some that are very, very small. So there's a huge range of different kinds of animals that fit into this big category of mammals. And the marine mammals come in all shapes and sizes. So there's a lot of diversity in this group as well. There are a few things that they tend to have in common. In adapting into a marine environment, there have been some dramatic changes in their body shape. So you'll tend to see streamlined bodies and reduced limbs. And these animals are moving quickly through the water. They often have large bodies and they often have special thick layers of fat, or at the very least thick fur, or both, because they're a warm-blooded animal trying to stay warm in water, and you lose a lot of heat when you're in water. So you'll see very large-bodied animals and you'll see special layers of insulation, fat and fur. They also have transformed the limbs usually into some kinds of flippers to help them move through the water environment. And sometimes they've reduced the hind limbs completely, and they just have flukes or a tail fin. Now, when you were sorting the animal evidence cards most recently, and you were asked which one of the marine mammals is the most similar to the land mammals that you were looking at. So take a moment and think to yourself which one you said. And we'll talk a little bit more now about what's the evidence that would help us understand what it means to say something is more or less similar. And to do that, we're going to think about geologic history, and we're going to think about the fossil record, and thinking about what the fossil record tells us about this interesting group of animals. So these marine mammals, when you say marine mammal, you're really talking about a mammal that has gone back to the ocean to find food and to live. And that means that different groups of mammals have done that over geologic time. And there's fossil evidence of 6 or 7 different lineages, completely different groups of mammals that independently return to the sea. And the most recent ones, there's just in the last few million years, 2-3 million years, are polar bears and sea otters. So those are both in the same group. And we'll talk about carnivores in a second. And polar bears are considered marine mammals because they hunt on the sea ice. So they're out catching their food out on the ocean. And of course, sea otters, we've been talking about. But in addition, much more ancient are at least 4 more groups of animals, and they'll mostly be familiar to you from your sorting cards. And they have, for tens of millions of years, been evolving and adapting in the ocean environment. And again, these are all groups of animals that separately have entered the ocean again, looking for food and evolving into the ocean environment. The fossil record shows us that not only do you have sea otters and cetaceans and pinnipeds and sirenians today, but there are there's fascinating fossil evidence of a whole range of animals from all of these groups that are completely extinct. They're no longer alive today, but there's a good fossil record of these different kinds of animals. One of them humans did overlap with, and we know of, because they were actually still around in the 1700s when European explorers were exploring in the Bering Sea, and they discovered these really amazing, very large animals that are in the sirenian family. They're called stellar sea cows, and those animals were different than the current day manatees and dugongs. For one thing, they were giant. They were 30 feet long. They weighed 4 to 19 tons. Now, an elephant weighs 6 to 7 tons. So these were huge animals. They had very different teeth. They were adapted to living in very cold water. They lived near shore. They had this very strange, very thick bark-like skin and a very thick blubber layer. And they were killed off by these Europeans in about 27 years. So they discovered them, and within 27 years, they had killed every single one, and they're now extinct. And there's just drawings and illustrations and those skeletons remaining of this amazing animal. And there were a lot of other kinds of sirenians that we have a fossil record for, and they're all extinct now. Also, there was a really interesting group of animals completely separate from the ones that we've been talking about that were aquatic sloths. And there's a good fossil record of these animals. There's at least 5 different species known of these animals, and there's abundant skeletal evidence, fossils from these, and they were all found off South America, off of Peru. And they probably had their tail was sort of paddle-like for swimming. And they think they may have used their claws actually for holding on to the bottom, so they could hold on to the bottom. And then based on their teeth and their muzzle, they think they grazed on seagrasses and aquatic vegetation, kind of the way the dugongs and manatees do. And of course, all of them are extinct. There's nothing like them left. So there's all sorts of interesting marine mammals that lived at some point over the last 50 million years, and they've gone extinct, and all we have is the fossil record for these animals. But we know there are lots of different kinds of animals that you could fit into this marine mammal category. We know that the sea otters and marine otters are fairly recent, and we know that the pinnipeds and the cetaceans and the sirenians have a much longer fossil record. So which did you say? Did you say the sea otter when you were predicting which one was the most similar? Sea otters evolved 2 or 3 million years ago, probably from river otters, and there's still a lot of similarities between them, but there are some big differences. For example, sea otters are much, much larger. So just as you would predict if an animal was going to adapt to living in the marine environment, they're going to be much larger. And sea otters are 50 to 100 pounds, whereas a river otter gets up to maybe 30 pounds. And they swim differently in the water. The sea otters will float high in the water on their backs, and they'll eat their food in the water, whereas a river otter swims on their stomach, their body's mostly underwater. And when they catch a fish or something, they bring it up on land and they eat on land. A river otter comes out and makes a den and will have a litter of 2 or 3 pups. A sea otter would only have 1 pup at a time. So there's some similarities, but they definitely have adapted to living in an ocean environment, and they are a distinct and special animal. Thinking about the fossil record, if you think about the remaining 3 groups that we've been talking about, the pinnipeds, which is the seals and the sea lions, the sirenians, the sea cows, and the cetaceans, the whales and the dolphins and the porpoises. So if you were going to think about which one of these is the most recent. They all have a long evolutionary history of tens of millions of years, and they're well adapted to the ocean environment. But one of these actually is returned to the ocean more recently. Okay, so we're going to take a short break, and I want you to take a few minutes to decide which group you predict has evolved back into the ocean the most recently. Do you think it is cetaceans, or sirenians, or pinnipeds? Now, scientists use evidence to support their predictions, so you should list at least 3 pieces of evidence based on the information that we've read from the animal evidence cards, from the graphs of the hearing ranges, and from your own observations of the different kinds of adaptations that each group has to their marine environment. Okay, I'll see you back here soon.